She was 23 years old. She worked the early shift at the textile mill on Route 15, and every morning she stopped at the Hartsville post office on her way home to pick up her mother's mail. On the morning of September 14, 1972, she walked in, licked a stamp, pressed it to an envelope, and handed it across the counter to the clerk on duty. Then, she walked out into the September heat of South Carolina and was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a young woman who disappeared. That is a story about a killer who had stood close enough to her to shake her hand and who spent the next 52 years living free in the same county where he committed his crime. And it would take a single dried strip of glue on the back of a used postal stamp, a DNA database that didn't exist until the 21st century, and one investigator who refused to close a file that everyone else had quietly shelved, to finally put his name to what he did. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to Darlington County in the autumn of 1972. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Beverly Jean Hartley was. Darlington County, South Carolina, in 1972, was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked on warm nights, and neighbors tracked each other's comings and goings, not out of nosiness, but out of genuine care. The county seat of Darlington sat roughly equidistant between Florence and Camden, a modest city of feed stores, Baptist churches, courthouse steps where old men played checkers in the shade, and a main street that still had a 5 and dime where you could get a cherry phosphate for a nickel. This was NASCAR country. The Darlington Raceway drew crowds every September from 3 states over, and the rest of the year the town lived at its own unhurried pace, marked by church socials, Friday night football, and the rhythms of the cotton and textile industries that employed most of the county. Station wagons sat in driveways. Rotary phones rang on kitchen walls. The evening news came on at 6, and most of the county watched it before supper. Beverly Jean Hartley had grown up on the north side of Darlington, the third of 4 children born to Clarence and Ruth Hartley. She had gone to St. John's High School, where she sang in the choir every Sunday, and after graduation, she had taken a job at the Abney Mills textile plant on Route 15, rather than wait tables or move to Columbia the way some of her girlfriends had. She was not the kind of young woman who dreamed loudly about leaving. She was the kind who found deep satisfaction in smaller things. She had her own apartment by the time she was 21, a 2-room place above the Guthrie family's garage on Cashua Ferry Road, and she paid her rent on the first of every month, no exceptions. Her co-workers at Abney Mills remembered her bringing in biscuits on Fridays, wrapped in a dish towel that still had the warmth of her oven in it. Her younger sister, Donna, would later tell investigators that Beverly had a habit of rereading the same 6 paperback novels on rotation, and that she kept a small ceramic cat on her windowsill named Mabel, who had been missing one ear since 1968. She had a boyfriend named Thomas Greer, who worked at an auto parts store in Florence and drove over on weekends. She was planning, according to both her mother and Donna, to eventually marry him. She had already told Ruth what kind of dress she wanted. On the morning of September 14th, Beverly Jean Hartley finished her early shift at Abney Mills at 7:45. Records from the mill confirmed she clocked out on time. A co-worker named Sandra Pickens walked with her to the parking lot, and the 2 women stood talking beside Beverly's car, a copper-colored 1969 Ford Maverick, for approximately 10 minutes before Sandra got in her own car and drove home. Beverly told Sandra she was stopping at the post office to pick up her mother's mail before going back to her apartment. That was the last time Sandra Pickens would see her alive. What happened in the next 90 minutes would consume Darlington County for decades. At 8:22 that morning, a postal clerk named Harold Dwight logged Beverly Jean Hartley into the post office's informal visitor record, a practice some rural post offices kept at the time, noting when certain P.O. box holders came in for their mail. Harold would tell investigators that Beverly was in good spirits, that she bought a book of stamps and licked one to use immediately, sealing an envelope she had carried in with her. He remembered because she made a face at the taste of the glue. She handed him the envelope for outgoing mail and left. He watched her pull out of the parking lot in the Copper Maverick and turn south on Pearl Street. That was 8:28. At 9:51, Beverly Jean Hartley's car was found parked at an angle on a gravel access road behind the old bird farm, 3 miles south of the post office. The engine was cold. The driver's side door was open. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her keys were in the ignition. Beverly was not there. She was found 3 days later, on September 17th, by a deer hunter working the tree line along the back edge of the bird farm property. The Darlington County Sheriff's Office confirmed her identity later that afternoon. Investigators noted that the Copper Maverick showed no signs of mechanical failure and no evidence that it had been forced off the road. Beverly Jean Hartley, according to the Sheriff's Office, had stopped that car herself. That detail would haunt the investigation for a generation. The lead investigator assigned to Beverly's case was a 38-year-old Darlington County Sheriff's deputy named Raymond Elias Proctor. Proctor had been with the department for 11 years and was known, according to old department records, as a methodical man who kept detailed case notes in a composition notebook rather than trusting everything to official forms. He told his supervisor in the first week of the investigation that he believed Beverly had been forced to stop the car by someone she recognized, someone she would have pulled over for voluntarily, a stranger behind a flashing light, or someone she knew. The gravel road was not on Beverly's typical route home. She had gone there on purpose, or been led there. The early investigation focused heavily on 2 men. The first was a farmhand named Earl Covington, who had a prior conviction for assault and whose trailer sat less than a mile from the access road where the Maverick was found. Deputies interviewed Covington 3 times in the first 2 weeks. His alibi, that he had been at a livestock auction in Lamar with his employer from 7 in the morning until afternoon, was eventually corroborated by 8 witnesses and confirmed in auction records from that day. Earl Covington was eliminated. The second person of interest was never named publicly. Court documents from a 1973 civil proceeding reference a second individual interviewed by the sheriff's office, a man described only as a white male in his late 20s, with a connection to the postal route that served Beverly's apartment complex. Proctor's notes, recovered decades later from the department archive, refer to this individual as Subject 2, and they show that Proctor attempted to re-interview him in the spring of 1973 and was told by his supervisor to focus investigative resources elsewhere. That instruction appeared in writing. The reason given was insufficient evidence to justify continued attention. Proctor's handwritten note in the margin of that memo read simply, "Not done." Beverly's family, Ruth, Clarence, her older brother Carl, and her younger sister Donna, kept vigil through the first months of the investigation the way families do. Ruth drove to the sheriff's office every week for the first year, sometimes twice. Carl drove the county roads on weekends with a photograph of Beverly taped to the passenger window of his truck, stopping at gas stations and farm stands to ask if anyone had seen anything. Thomas Greer, Beverly's boyfriend, gave an interview to the Darlington Morning News in October 1972, saying he could not eat or sleep and that he was going to find out what happened to her no matter how long it took. 3 years later, he had moved to Georgia and remarried. The case went cold before anyone used that phrase. By 1978, 6 years had passed since Beverly Jean Hartley was found in that field. Ruth Hartley had stopped driving to the sheriff's office, not because she had given up, but because she had learned that there was nothing new to hear, and the drive was 35 minutes each way. Clarence had taken early retirement from the county road crew in 1976 after a mild heart attack, and the doctor told Ruth that the stress of the open case was not helping him heal. The Hartley family had not stopped. They had simply adjusted to the weight of an answer that refused to come. Raymond Proctor retired from the Darlington County Sheriff's Office in 1989, after 17 years in the department. His composition notebook containing his Beverly Hartley case notes retired with him, into a cardboard box he kept in his spare bedroom. His daughter would later say that he talked about Beverly Hartley the way other men talked about the fish they hadn't caught. Not obsessively, but returning to the thought. He had 2 names he kept coming back to, she said. Subject 2 was one of them. By 1995, Ruth Hartley was 71 years old and had buried both Clarence and Carl. She sat on the porch of the house on the north side of Darlington and told her daughter Donna that she was not afraid to die, but that she was afraid of dying before the answer came. The reward poster that had hung in the window of the Darlington pharmacy since November 1972 had faded to a pale suggestion of itself. Nobody took it down. Donna Hartley Sims, as she was known by then, had taken over as the family's primary contact with the sheriff's office. She called once a year, on September 14th. For a long time, there was nothing new to tell her. Then, in 2004, the Darlington County Sheriff's Office became part of a state-level cold case initiative that digitized old case files and submitted unidentified biological evidence to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's forensic database. Beverly's case was among those flagged. But the biological samples recovered in 1972, limited by the forensic capabilities of that era, yielded no usable DNA profile. The file was marked active and placed back in storage. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'll be right back with Beverly. The case had been cold for 49 years when a forensic genealogist in Columbia named Patricia Ellison pulled a box of physical evidence from a sled storage unit in the spring of 2021. Patricia had been contracted by the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit as part of a new state initiative using investigative genetic genealogy, the same technology that had broken open the Golden State Killer case in California in 2018 to re-examine dormant South Carolina homicide files. The process works by uploading DNA from crime scene evidence to public ancestry databases, then cross-referencing partial matches with family trees built by living relatives, tracing the genetic signature back through generations until it points to a single likely contributor. What she found in Beverly Hartley's evidence box was not what anyone expected. The 1972 biological samples were insufficient. The technology existed now to read them, but there wasn't enough viable material from the original scene to construct a workable profile. Patricia was about to log the box as a dead end when her assistant, going through the last items, found something in a sealed evidence envelope that had never been submitted for laboratory analysis. A notation on the outside of the envelope, in Raymond Proctor's handwriting, read, "Outgoing envelope, post office counter, subject handled, September 14th, 1972. It was the envelope Beverly had handed to Harold Dwight across the post office counter that morning. the one she had sealed with a stamp she licked herself. Patricia Ellison sat with that envelope for a long moment before she made the call to the cold case unit. The stamp, adhered to the envelope for 49 years, had been preserved in sealed evidence storage. And on the underside of that stamp, in the dried saliva of whoever had licked it before pressing it down, was Dina, not Beverly's. The envelope had been addressed to Beverly's mother in Beverly's handwriting, but the stamp had not been licked by Beverly. Harold Dwight's original statement confirmed that Beverly had taken a stamp from the new book she purchased and licked it herself at the counter. But this envelope, brought in from outside, had already been sealed, already stamped. The stamp on this envelope had been licked by whoever prepared the letter Beverly was carrying, a letter she had written and sealed before coming to the post office. Someone else had put the stamp on it. Someone who lived with her or visited her home. The process that followed took 14 months. Patricia's team uploaded the Dina profile extracted from the stamp adhesive to GeneMatch, one of the public genealogy databases used in investigative genetic genealogy work. Partial matches began to surface, not close relatives, but distant cousins, second cousins, fourth cousins, sharing small segments of genetic material with the unknown contributor. From those matches, using publicly available genealogy records, census data, birth and death records, and the tireless construction of family trees that sometimes branched into the hundreds, Patricia's team worked backward and forward and sideways until one branch kept appearing. A family from Darlington County. A family that had lived in the county in 1972, with a son who would have been 26 years old in September of that year. On a Tuesday morning in November 2022, cold case investigators with the Darlington County Sheriff's Office and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division made contact with the subject at his residence in Hartsville, the same town where Beverly had gone to the post office that morning, 50 years before. His name was Gerald Dennis Sutton. He was 76 years old. He had lived in Hartsville for most of his life, had been married twice, had 4 adult children, and had spent 22 years working as a rural mail carrier for the United States Postal Service in Darlington County. He had delivered mail on the route that included Beverly Jean Hartley's apartment complex on Cashua Ferry Road. Investigators asked Gerald Sutton to submit a voluntary Dina sample. He declined. A court-authorized Dina sample was obtained and submitted to the SLED laboratory in Columbia. The results came back in January 2023. The Dina extracted from the stamp on Beverly Hartley's outgoing envelope was a match to Gerald Dennis Sutton. The probability of error was less than 1 in 1 trillion. When Darlington County Sheriff's investigators went to Gerald Sutton's home to make the arrest on February 7, 2023, he answered the door in a cardigan sweater. He did not run. He did not deny it. He said very little. His neighbors on his quiet Hartsville street would later tell the local television station that they could not believe it, that Gerald Sutton had been the kind of man who brought in packages for the elderly woman next door, who remembered every grandchild's name, who waved from his driveway every single morning for 30 years. One neighbor, a woman who had lived across the street from him for a decade, said she simply sat down in her kitchen and could not speak for a long time after she heard the news. Gerald Sutton had been, in Raymond Proctor's notes, subject to the man on Beverly's postal route. The man Proctor had been told to stop investigating in the spring of 1973, when there was not yet enough evidence and cold case science was still a generation away from the tools it would one day have. Court documents filed in the subsequent proceedings confirmed that Sutton had been interviewed by the sheriff's office in October 1972 and again in February 1973 before the investigation into him was suspended. He had, for 50 years, continued living his ordinary life in the same county where Beverly Jean Hartley's family lived. He had delivered mail, he had raised children, he had grown old. He had been, by all outward appearances, a decent and unremarkable man. Gerald Dennis Sutton was charged with murder in the first degree. He entered a guilty plea in October 2023 before the Darlington County Circuit Court. He was sentenced to life in prison. He made no statement at sentencing. He stared at the table in front of him while the judge read the verdict into the record. In the gallery, Donna Hartley Sims sat with her husband and her 2 adult children and wept quietly. She had been attending proceedings at that courthouse for most of a year. She was 70 years old. She had been 20 years old in September of 1972. Ruth Hartley died in 2008, 15 years before the arrest. She never knew the name. Donna has said publicly that she keeps this fact somewhere between grief and gratitude. Grief that her mother never had the answer, and gratitude that she herself lived long enough to receive it. Patricia Ellison, the forensic genealogist whose team did the work that brought the name forward, gave a brief interview to the Columbia State newspaper after the conviction. She said that in her experience doing this work, the most important thing investigators could do was never discard physical evidence, no matter how old, no matter how seemingly irrelevant, no matter how many decades separated the collection from the technology that might someday read it. A stamp. A dried strip of glue. The trace of a man's saliva preserved in a sealed envelope in a cardboard box in a storage unit for 49 years. Beverly Jean Hartley was 23 years old. She worked the early shift and brought biscuits on Fridays and kept a one-eared ceramic cat named Mabel on her windowsill. She sang in a choir and planned a wedding and drove a copper Maverick and stopped at the post office on the way home from work on the last morning of her life because her mother needed her mail. She had a future that belonged to her. What was taken from her was not just her life. It was every morning that came after that September morning, every biscuit she would have baked, every song she would have sung. Every year her mother waited at a phone that did not ring with the right news. 52 years is a very long time for a truth to be held inside a stamp. But the truth did not disappear. It waited, the way evidence waits, with a patience that outlasts the people who thought they had escaped it. What do you think justice looks like after 50 years? Does a guilty plea, made in silence, give a family closure, or just an answer? And what does it say about our evidence storage and forensic systems that a case solved in 2023 hinged on something collected in 1972 that no one thought to fully test? Leave your thoughts below. This conversation, every time it happens in these comments, matters. Justice came for Beverly Jean Hartley after 52 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, because truth, however patient it has to be, always finds its way to the surface. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. And if you want more solved cold cases, the links are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.